In the furthest reaches of Antarctica, temperatures plunge well below -70, cold enough to cause frostbite within seconds. In 1910, a British expedition set out to conquer this frozen frontier. They were determined to be the first to reach the South Pole, but what began as a carefully planned mission soon descended into chaos. One by one, misfortune struck, and the men of the expedition found themselves battling for survival without food, without shelter, and in the most extreme place on Earth. This is the story of Captain Scott's Terra Nova Expedition. It was 1910 and Captain Robert Falcon Scott set out on what he called the British Antarctic Expedition, in more modern times known as the Terra Nova Expedition. To Scott, this mission wasn't only about planting a flag for Britain at the South Pole, it was also intended to gather science along the way. Meteorology, geology, and even fossils from Antarctica's hidden interior. The blend of glory and discovery that this mission offered drove him forward. But he wasn't alone. While Scott had left England announcing a mission of science and exploration, Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian explorer, quietly diverted his own expedition towards the South Pole. Scott only discovered this when a telegram reached him in Australia after he was already underway. And from that moment on, the expedition was not just about discovery. For Scott, it was literally a race. And with Britain's pride on the line, Scott felt the weight of urgency pressing down on every decision he would make. By early January of 1911, after months at sea, their vessel, the Terra Nova, forced its way through the pack ice and landed on Ross Island, just off the coast of Antarctica. The men are met with brutal wind and temperatures, but immediately get to work. They're at a place called Cape Evans, and this is where Scott's men built a timber hut and filled it full of supplies. They brought with them a lot of cold weather gear, which included thick wool clothing, windproof outer layers, and reindeer skin sleeping bags. This gear was heavy, but it was suited for the cold temperatures they would face hauling themselves across the open ice. In order to make the trek of 1,600 kilometers to the South Pole, Scott would use a mix of systems. He brought with him 3 experimental motor sledges, which had been untested in the Antarctic cold. Against better advice, Scott decided to use ponies to haul their sledges instead of sled dogs. They were purchased from Siberia. Though the crew didn't have a lot of expertise in this area, they ended up buying rather old ponies. Now, Scott did bring dogs with him as well, but they were more kept in reserve in case the ponies fails. Scott's main thinking about bringing the ponies was that they could be used as meat when they were no longer of use for hauling gear. The choices to bring untested motor sledges, aging ponies, and not rely on sled dogs, which have proved themselves useful so many times in the Arctic, was a choice that would come back to haunt Scott time and time again. But Scott was convinced this would give them the best chance at reaching the South Pole. Scott's strategy was built around layers of men and supplies. From Cape Evans, the entire force set out together on November 1st, 1911, almost 11 months after they landed in Antarctica. They would drag sledges and drive animals south across the Great Ice Barrier. Along the way, smaller support parties with men like Cherry-Garrard, Tom Crean and Atkinson would peel away in stages after laying out depots of food and fuel. Some would head back to Cape Evans, while others would go on to conduct scientific research. The design was simple on paper. The farther they went, the lighter the core group would be, supported by caches of supplies waiting for them on their return. Only a chosen few would make the final push to the South Pole. But in the Antarctic extremes, things rarely go as expected. And almost from the beginning in early November, storms rolled in across the Great Ice Barrier, what we now call the Ross Ice Shelf, which is a frozen plain the size of France, stretching endlessly southward, offering no reprieve from the wind. And that wind howled across its surface with such force that the men staggered to keep sledges upright. Snowdrifts would bury ponies up to their bellies. The motor sledges, which were untested in these extremes, broke down one by one. With the motor sledges gone, the dogs and ponies would have to share the burden of hauling the equipment. But the ponies quickly became the weak link. They were already worn and ill-suited for soft snow, and some would begin to collapse in storms, unable to rise again. The rest slowly grew too weak to walk and were shot where they stood. Their carcasses were left behind as planned. They would be food caches for the return march home. The dogs, which were much stronger on the ice and better suited for this type of trek, carried the effort forward a little further. But Scott, like I said earlier, never trusted the dogs. In his mind, the dogs would be more work than they were help. But he knew that he may need them again. His decision was to send the dogs back with Cherry-Garrard in mid-December. The idea being to rest the dogs and the men so that they may be able to do a relief run later on. Now with the ponies dead and the dogs withdrawn, the burden of hauling the gear shifted entirely onto human shoulders. Men lashed themselves into the harnesses and began pulling the sledges into the biting winds. Despite the extreme conditions and the loss of the animals, the men pushed on. They pressed farther south, leaving behind a lifeline at depots. But the most vital one, named the 1-ton depot, ended up being planted more than 30 miles short of its intended position. This was done because of the extreme weather and the loss of the animals. But those 30 miles would mean the difference between life and death. As they laid out the depots one by one, support teams were turning back in waves, slowly leaving Scott and a shrinking party marching deeper into the interior. Day after day, they battled the Great Ice Barrier, which slowly gave way to the Beardmore Glacier, which they would have to climb. Now, this glacier was dangerous because it was full of shattered ridges and hidden traps that they would have to claw through to get up onto what's known the Polar Plateau. As they climbed further in elevation, the air would grow thinner and the cold even sharper. The weight of the sledges in these conditions seemed to double with every step. The men leaned into their harnesses, dragging the gear across the glassy blue ice, which was scoured by the wind. Their breath freezing in their beards, leaving icicles hanging from their faces. More than once, the surface of the ice gave way, opening into dark crevasses. Edgar Evans, the strongest of the group, fell through one of these crevasses and was hauled out by his companions in a frantic effort. He survived the fall, but it left him battered and weakened, with wounds that would come back to bite him later. By January of 1912, the last of the support teams turned back, leaving only 5 men to push on. Scott himself, along with Wilson, Bowers, Oates, and even the wounded Evans. They were gaunt, frostbitten, and half-starved, but still, they pressed across the endless plateau, inching ever closer towards the South Pole. On January 17, 1912, after 2 months of punishing travel, they actually reached the South Pole. Instead of cheering in triumph, they noticed a black flag that snapped in the wind. They also noticed that a small tent stood in the snow, neatly anchored with supplies stacked inside, and a note addressed to the King of Norway. Roald Amundsen had been there first, 5 weeks earlier. Scott opened his diary, which read, "Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." Their march to the South Pole, which had taken them through storms, starvation, across deadly crevices, offered no victory, only despair. They weren't the first to reach the South Pole, meaning Scott would never get his glory. And now, with their strength broken, there was a far more dangerous journey ahead of them, the march home. Well, I hope you're liking this content, and if you do, consider subscribing or sharing it with somebody you know. Also, check out our Against All Odds Historic Survival playlist on the channel. It's got a lot more content like this. We're also going to be uploading a few earlier videos I did on the channel that have been re-edited with all the stuff I've learned in the last year. And with that, I'll move on. The return march was unforgiving from the very first steps away from the pole. The men were gaunt, their clothes were crusted with frost, their skin burned raw by the wind. Each day the temperature seemed to fall lower, and the sledges became heavier. Every calorie they burned dragged them closer to collapse. For Edgar Evans, who was the strongest of them all, his decline was swift. When he had fallen into the ice crevasse, his hand had sustained some cuts that ended up being infected. And on the outward march home, frostbite took a hold of what was left of his hands. He was also showing signs of a head injury and was stumbling constantly. He even struck his head a second time and then began slipping into delirium. The man who had once been a powerhouse of the sledges was fading into dead weight, and the others could only watch in silence. But Evans' decline was only part of their undoing. The cheaper truth was that the entire expedition was now paying the price for decisions made long before. The motor sledges had failed in the first weeks, the ponies had struggled in the deep snow and died before expected. Their meat cached along the route, but their pulling power lost forever. The dogs that Scott never fully trusted had been sent back early, which meant there was no forward operating team to bring relief to them. And with Evans failing, the 1-ton depot that could be their only real hope in this situation for him was planted 30 miles short, leaving them starving and battling the temperatures far longer than they intended. All those choices, each small compromise and gamble, now returned with a vengeance. The 5 men who had reached the pole were left to haul everything themselves on starving bodies in a land where no mistakes would be forgiven. And when they made it back to the base of the Beardmore Glacier, Evans collapsed. But no amount of effort could get him to rise again, and this became his final resting spot, having died on February 17, 1912. His gear and rations were divided among the survivors, but each man was also forced to carry more as their numbers shrank. Losing the strongest of them was more than a tragedy. It was a breaking point where the expedition's grand design began to unravel completely, because if Evans could die, none of them were safe. By March, the men were already shadows of themselves. Their rations had been cut to stretch supplies, leaving them perpetually hungry. Each day's portion of pemmican, biscuits, and tea barely replaced half the calories they burned. Their bodies were literally consuming themselves. Heat was always in short supply. At night, they would crowd into reindeer skin sleeping bags, their breath frosting the canvas walls of the tent. To melt snow for drinking water, they scraped the last drops of fuel from tins of paraffin, but the shortages meant their food was never fully cooked and their tea often lukewarm. Fires were impossible in the polar wind. The toll on their bodies was brutal, not to mention the frostbite which gnawed at their fingers and toes. And for Captain Lawrence Oates, the punishment for him was worst of all. The cold had destroyed his feet, leaving him barely able to stand. Each step was agony, and he dragged himself along in silence, knowing he was slowing the group to a crawl, while their rations dwindled and the weather worsened. Finally, in the middle of a blizzard, Oates made his choice. He exited the tent and stood in his wrapped furs and looked at the others and said, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." He stepped into the storm and he never returned. The story is that he walked off into the cold to sacrifice himself for the others, to buy them a little bit more time and a few more calories. But unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. And the 3 men who remained, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, began pushing into weather that grew colder and crueler with every passing day as the Antarctic winter was starting to show its teeth. With Oates gone, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers pushed on for another 2 weeks. In the last week of March 1912, they had been marching for almost 130 days, covering 1,600 miles on foot. They were only 11 miles from the 1-ton depot, but storms had pinned them down. Miles might as well have been 100. Waiting out the storm, they had no choice but to pitch their tent on the ice and wait for the weather to break. But it never did. The blizzard roared without pause day after day. Slowly, their food and fuel ran out. Inside, they huddled together, too weak to move and too cold to sleep. Their bodies literally wasted to bone, and fingers so cold they could no longer work. One by one, the men would stop rising. Wilson, the quiet doctor, was the first to fade, slipping into silence without saying a word. Bowers, who had always kept everyone alive with their bustling energy, followed soon after. He crawled into his sleeping bag and never awoke. That left a beaten and battered Scott completely alone at the end of the earth. During this time, Scott had recorded the party's fate without panic. He would write about the deaths of his men, the endless blizzard, and their dwindling rations. During this time, Scott wrote letters to family, friends, and to the public. Scott would make his final journey entry on March 29, 1912. And it said,
"We shall stick it out to the end, but we're getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write any more. Scott, for God's sake, look after our people."
And that last line is thought to be possibly a request to the government or others to look after the families of the men who all passed. But during this time, we know that the men slowly died of exposure one by one. And after putting that journal down, Scott too would pass away from exposure. Now, it's not 100% clear in which order the last 3 men died, but that is his final journal entry. And by the end of March 1912, it is assumed that all 3 men had died. And not long after the heat went out, the blizzard buried their tent in the snow, sealing it like a tomb. It would be months later when a search party finally comes across it, and they find the 3 men lying side by side as if they were asleep. Around them were the diaries, letter, and a bundle of rocks. There were fossils that they had insisted on hauling back because it was proof that Antarctica had once held ancient forests. Now that was something so scientifically significant that it would be the basis for proving that continental drift actually happened. And even in their final hours, the men had clung to science and their purpose. They reached the bottom of the world, but unfortunately, Antarctica would refuse to let them leave alive. The other parties that didn't trek to the South Pole all survived the Terra Nova expedition, and some of them achieved remarkable results, including conducting pioneering studies in geology, biology, and meteorology that remain valuable to this day. Britain enshrines Scott as a tragic hero, but the truth is harsher. His story is one of hubris. Not listening to tried and true method and forging out on his own in an extreme environment, foregoing the use of sled dogs, bringing things like ponies or untested equipment, and being undone by Antarctica itself. So that's where the story wraps up, and I just want to say thanks for listening in this week, and we'll be back again next week.